If you're using anything other than Indeed for your hiring, you are wasting your time.
We are TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
Coming to you live and direct from the phantom shores of this ghostly Hudson River of New York. My name is Ra Castaldo, and I am here to awaken those dormant particles that are spiraling inside your DNA. So come with me as we go further down this mystic spiral of life. Inside the Eye of Ra, each and every week we unveil the different shades of you, the different shades of me, until we are all vibrating the truth frequency. Welcome, everybody. It is the spring equinox, March 20th, 2021, of course. And I'm very happy to be here live on the Truth Frequency Radio Network. My guest tonight is the regular guest here on Soul Station Radio inside the Eye of Ra. And he actually appears on many shows on the Truth Frequency Radio Network throughout his career. And he's a regular guest on my show, and it's always a pleasure to have him. You can find Mr. Gary Wayne at Genesis6Conspiracy.com. And he has a book by the same name, everybody. If you're just finding out, he has Genesis 6 Conspiracy, well-known book when it comes to the Nephilim. And I don't know where I'm getting that feedback from. Is that from mine? Getting some feedback right now. But everybody, it is the spring equinox here on the Truth Frequency Radio Network, and I'm very happy to be joining you guys. You can find me at the mysticalspiralstore.com, and of course, in all religions, in all backgrounds, the spring equinox is a very important time of year. In mystery traditions, they talk about it's the time where certain returns of the goddess come, right? Even Persephone looks to return from the realm of Dis, basically, in some of the traditions. And this is the very important time to be discussing. Also, we just passed what they call St. Patrick's Day, right? And so we're going to be discussing with Mr. Gary Wayne tonight, and he's very happy to be having him here and spending some time with us, is St. Patrick and the various information and data that has to go along with St. Patrick, because he is a very mysterious figure, and even is very mysterious. And it seems that the Catholic Church could not get rid of the worship and the belief in St. Patrick, so they had to sort of roll with the punches and somehow convert him to their faith, right? Because he was actually looked at as like a demon talker, like he was part of the problem, that he was part of the mysteries and part of the whole conjuring spirits related to the Nephilim. And somehow along the line, people like St. Patrick, St. Columba, St. David, different people like this sort of got coerced into the Catholic faith to bring people. So we're going to be talking about this deeply with Gary tonight. Gary, you with me, buddy?
I am, and so happy to be with you. And I think I'm really going to enjoy the discussion about St. Patrick and everything that sort of surrounds it and all the history that goes with it. I think it'll be a little bit eye-opening for people, but hopefully eye-opening in a way that just makes them think a little bit more about the things that are celebrated that there's always a history there. And lots of times there's a hidden history, and that's what we're going to dig into tonight.
Yeah, I mean, because I think most people don't realize it. I mean, they sort of even associate it with like kind of the get drunk day. Just get drunk and forget about it, and don't even worry about it. But it seems that before Saint Patrick was Saint Patrick, right? He sort of was denounced by the church for his wizardry, for his necromancy, even if you want to say, and for being a sorcerer. So maybe we should start a little bit before we even get into some miracles attributed to him and some of the, Druid connection, his origins, because even his place of birth is not set in stone. Some say he was born and then around the age 6, I think he was a colony of Great Britain or something like that, and then eventually he became a slave. So I don't know if he was a part of the Gauls or where he was part of it, but around his teenage years, they say that he was picked up by pirates or however you want to call whatever you want to call them, and brought to Ireland as a slave, right?
Yeah, he was sort of adopted, but he was always from a bloodline family, a wealthy family, and was adopted by, very wealthy people. So his background as to when that tends to happen in history is usually not quite what meets the eye. So one expects that they have some significant bloodlines, and with his interest that goes into England and Ireland, one would expect that he may have had royal bloodlines that would have led back to the Druidic priests or the kingships of the Tuatha De Danann.
Yeah.
What we do know, about his early beginnings is that he was, I guess, educated in the religion of Catholicism at a town of Auxerre, where he became a bishop of Auxerre. But if we sort of keep in mind that he may have had bloodline teachings and initiations and adopted by another wealthy bloodline family, and he's put into this monastic order that's in Auxerre, then it starts to make sense that he's being educated not necessarily in Catholicism. That would be part of it, certainly for the superficial veneer, but he would be educated in more of the mysteries than anything else, because this was a location and a monastic order that was the Benedictine monks, and the Benedictine monks were a Gnostic order, and they were very much part of the Augustine order that was in England, that was building all of the churches in England. They had a building guild, and that's because a lot of the Gnostics went underground in the from the builder guilds of the Roman collegia, and into monastic orders and into builder guilds to be protected from persecution from. So he's actually mentored in the 400s by a fellow that I think is quite infamous in his name, and that's Saint Germain. And so he, right from the beginning, is, has very, very sort of suspicious sort of history and beginnings. And they're going to try and bring in, whether or not it's the Welsh or it's Ireland, they're going to be bringing in more, we'll call it Druidic religions, into the same sort of organizational structure that the Gnostics have molded themselves into, which are monastic orders. And that's what I think St. Patrick is doing. As we start to dig into a little bit more of the detail of what he actually does, I think that's exactly what's going on, because the Celtic Christian Church is going to be taken over by the Benedictines a little bit later in the time of St. Bernard, and it's going to fully fund them and protect them, right? It's going they're going to come home to that whole monastic order and be, part of the larger sort of group. So I think that's sort of the first step of what St. Patrick is doing. is bringing them into the church, but to be that hidden mold-in religion that the monastic orders are. And of course, all of these monastic orders are, very ascetic, right? And people have, if you get sort of any imagery of the asceticism, it's like Opus Dei would be a modern one, which is kind of called Christian Masonry, and one of the reasons for its creation. But it goes back to the ascetic orders of the Essenes, which again is the polytheist arm of Judaism, along with Kabbalism. The Essenes take their ancient religion back to Heliopolis and to the religion of the Egyptians, and the Kabbalists bring back the Mesopotamian or Sumerian mysticism back from Babylon, that becomes sort of the two pillars of mysticism within Judaism, and so the monastic orders are based on the Essene monastic order because it was the first ascetic monastic order in the West, and that was exported from the Eastern religions into the West.
It's interesting that his name is like close to patriarch too, right? It's like the very spelling patriarch. It's very interesting that it's like that. I agree with you. And when you're saying the certain orders, even with the Masons, it seems like they're all connected to even being part of the Sons of the Serpent tribes, even to be connected. We're even called serpents. And before we go even into all that, there is a connection too with the Ark of the Covenant with Ireland, right? There always was like a connection with the Ark in Ireland, and I always wondered if there was more to that story, or if it even had to do with times with St. Patrick and things like that, because this area was known as what the god, or the goddess Danu, right? The goddess Dana or Danu, or the Tuatha Danann, and it's quite possible that there was some sort of ancient technology brought to that area, right? What's your opinion on that?
I'll circle back on that in just a second. So the etymology of Patrick is Latin patricius, or patrician, i.e. nobleman. So I'm not thinking that might have been his real name. And Old English, it's derives from paega, meaning unknown, rice, or meaning king and ruler. So typically, I think that name is probably sort of a title that was applied to him, which is not unusual for changing names in history. And again, to reflect that he was more of a noble bloodline than what we're led to believe. But all of the priests of the Catholic order that were of any significance, all the ones that really rose to a significant position, they're a part of the black nobility, right? They're part of the bloodlines out of Italy, or the bloodlines of the countries that they're in, because that's part of the organizational structure of the bloodline kings to control the government and the army, and with siblings that are controlling the religious aspect, that all work together. So that would make some sense. Now, I don't have anything on the Ark going to Ireland. We have lots of information about the Ark going by the St. Clairs and the St. Clairs to Scotland, and then over to Oak Island, and elsewhere from there. But what does go to Ireland, to Tara, and then over to with the Dalriadic kings over to Scotland, that is going to be part of the De Bruce of the Rollo bloodlines dynasty of Scotland, is as they Scion bloodlines in from Welsh and from Ireland and from the Picts in Scotland, who are also part of the Tuatha Danann as well.
There was a story associated with, I thought, like Jeremiah or something.
Yeah, there is. I'm getting there. I'll try and get there a little faster. How's that?
No. So, go. Take your time. I thought that was the Ark of the Covenant. I might have got it confused.
There's two important things that come. One is from Akhenaten's throne, which is
take your time, though. I'm not rushing for sure.
Yeah. The stone. No worries. The stone of destiny that is, crowned upon. Kings are crowned upon, and where they crown the kings of Tara. And that came from the tribe of Skoda, and Neol, who is a Scythian, Sarmatian, Rephaim king that intermarries with Skoda. That's the daughter of Akhenaten, and they migrate to Spain and then over to Ireland. And there are two Skodas, but the other rock that comes over is the Bethel stone, which is the stone where Jacob has his name changed to Israel, and he wrestles with the angel of God, and it has to do with the ladder that goes into heaven. And this comes over with Tamar and one of the scribes of Jeremiah at the time of that Babylonian apocalypse, where the southern kingdom gets exiled into Babylon. They escape to Ireland.
Was that Baruch?
Yeah. And so that's where that intertwines.
That's the story I heard. Yeah.
And both of those items go to Scotland. And during the wars between England and Scotland trying to win their independence, is the Stone of Destiny was captured and taken down, and still sits today under the throne of England, and where Queen Elizabeth sits, and still is the stone that is used for the anointing of a new king there. So yeah, there's a long sort of history there of that kind of thing, and into people who were the shining ones, the fairy people, and this is the Tuatha De Danann that you were talking about, with that has many gods. One of them is Danu, but is more accurately said, and you're very familiar with Diana because she's the king of the fairies, and also Danu, D''Anu, the tribe of Danu, or the tribe of Anu, that migrated from Scythia again, which is why Skoda and Neol go to Ireland. It's kin people to Neol, her husband, and a king of Scythia, and that's the people who in secular and polytheist history escape from Tartarus, what I would call the second sort of abyss, maybe the counterfeit abyss, and escape after the flood. And they have red hair, hazel eyes, and blonde hair and blue eyes. So that's also part of the Aryan mythos as well. And these are the people that are migrating to Ireland and are the Tuatha De Danann, or the fairy people. So anyways, I wanted to get some of those details in before we backtrack onto St. Patrick, because it's actually all intermixed in what's happening with the Patrick story.
Yeah, it's true. It's truly remarkable. I mean, when it's all mixed together, even when you come down to even to now in modern times, when you have like UFO sightings and UFO encounters, with them reporting they've seen some sort of red-haired figure or red-haired alien type being or red-haired human in the craft, So when you even say Tartarus, are we referring to like an underworld dimension, or maybe an inner Earth world, possibly?
Inner Earth world, a prison that would have been interdimension. So, and even in the Bible, you're going to have Tartarus in the New Testament. That is the root word for abyss in one of the chapters. But
how do you think that relates to the Tartarians?
Well, it's directly related. So I think there's two abysses, though. There's one for the fallen angels, and along the sides of that is for the demon spirits of those Rephaim and Nephilim that were slain. But this is one that seems to be one that was created by the gods, because in Greek mythology, the heroes, the titans of the earth, the giants in Greek mythology, they rebelled against the gods, just as the lower gods rebelled against the parent gods. And I guess if you're going to have offspring that is rebellious, they're going to produce more rebellious offspring. But these giants that lost the war with Zeus were put into Tartarus. And I think that's a different abyss, because they're able to escape after the flood, as opposed to the angels and the spirit demons, who aren't able to escape after the flood. But these ones are. and they escape into Scythia, and they will go south into Sumeria as part of the tribe of Danu. They will go north along the Danube River, named likely after them, and into Denmark and into Norway and Sweden to become the blonde-haired, blue-eyed version. They will also migrate into Romania and Transylvania, that Vlad the Impaler takes his bloodlines back through. They are also expanding into the Ukraine and into who are the original Tsarist kings from ancient history. And these are the same ones that are the Tartarian kings that created this sort of mythical, and I use that word probably poorly, but this mythical empire that, is not known a whole bunch about, that, was in power up to a couple hundred years ago. And we don't get a lot of history out of these, but this was a global sized empire that was not small.
Isn't it interesting how much it's coming into Isn't it interesting how much it's coming into like the collective thought and research of everybody in the last few years as well? It's sort of like coming back around. It's a hot topic as of lately.
It is, and it mixes into and then a thousand different ways, from mudslides to apocalypses to all sorts of different things that and I try and keep close to what we can identify as history as possible, and the consistent sort of factors that come out of history to describe what that was all about. And so where that sort of intersects with kind of real history is that the Mongolian Empire was thought to be part of the Tartarian Empire.
Yeah, they even say that Genghis Khan had reddish hair.
Yeah, well, he claims, the mythos is he claims descendancy from King Og.
Really?
Yeah.
I'd never heard that before.
I've heard it and I've read it, but I've not been able to substantiate it. But that's the sort of the myth that goes along with it.
Wow, yeah. I mean, there's a whole bunch of mythos that goes along with him that I've read with Genghis Khan. Even that he used to go to the mountains and communicate with the sky gods, and he was born with this bright red birthmark in his left hand that they prophesized he would be, a slayer and a killer.
Yeah, his bloodline seemed to come down from there and through the Khan family, and then also, there'd be some dragon bloodlines out of Asia that would have been into that mix. So I think there's a scioning of bloodlines that came together for Genghis Khan. So, and again, I know the regular mythos is that he wasn't really anybody of significance, and
I don't know.
But he seemed to rise to power in a special way that's largely unaccounted for.
How do you think before we get back to St. Patrick, because we got about 3 minutes till break, so we'll start after break right back into St. Patrick, but how do you think the Denisovans fit into all this? They seem to be almost like a hybrid race as well.
They are, and and you also have like Neanderthals, right? And so I think they were people before the flood, obviously, in terms of the dating. And depending on how old you think the Earth is when you would sort of fit them in. So if you think the Earth is older, then they would be before the Earth was destroyed the first go around. With the gap theory and the renewal of the Earth theory that happens after that. If you're a shorter time version person, then you're going to look at the days of creation as being at least 1,000 years, as it's described in 2 Peter, and that from days 4 to 6, you have at least 2,000 years before humans are created. So you have all of these other beings being created in days 4 and 5, and then you also have, day 7, that's another 1,000 years, and then sometime afterwards, and we're not sure when. A lot of people think day 8, but we're not told that exactly, is when Adam is created. So the people in day 6 have a completely different set of details to their creation that is totally at odds with the Adam and then later Eve creation. So there's, for my reconciliation, is that there are two different creations, one of humans in day 6, and then the Adam and the Eve creation sometime later. And then you have this period before humans are created in day 6 that they could have been created with the other beings that are being created, because we also have the Nakash or the Nahesh, and we don't know when they're created, but they're a supernatural being that are enchanters and have mystical knowledge as well, and seem to be the followers of the fallen angels at that point in time. So who are they? Are they part of the Neanderthals or denizens, or are they, again, another separate race that we don't have a lot of information on to reconcile who they are?
Well, yeah, I mean, they even tend to use that word for the serpent in the garden, right? The Nakash, right?
That's exactly it, yeah. And it was a walking, talking, intelligent human being, and you take back on a Hebrew etymology, and it means basically enchanter or wizard, and terms like that.
You know what's interesting too, in their Kabbalistic belief is that their gematria, the Hebrew gematria for Nakash, is the same as the Hebrew gematria for Messiah. So that's how they believe, from the Hebrew aspect of their Kabbalistic belief, that serpent and Messiah are sort of entwined and encoded with the same thing. You know?
Well, that they take that back through Egyptian and Sumerian words like Musgal, Usamagal, and from Egyptian, which is more closely, it would be Muses or Meses, which they also will say through in Kabbalism that Moses derives from the name. Wow. And then Mesa as being the root word for Messiah, and this is a serpent being that they're talking about.
Wow, amazing. And there's just so much endless information. It's a month here inside the Eye of Ra on Truth Frequency Radio Network. Don't go anywhere, everybody. We're just getting warmed up here tonight on the spring equinox. Don't go nowhere. We'll be right back as we spiral out.
You are now tuned into the Truth Frequency.
Your protection from deception. TLR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm so glad you guys are here. Thank you for sticking around. Whether you're hearing us on Truth Frequency Radio, on iHeartRadio, or paranormal radio apps, wherever you are embedded in this matrix, thank you for tuning in. My name is Ra Castaldo. I am live here every Saturday night from 7 to 9 Eastern, or 4 to 6 Pacific, or like I said, wherever you are embedded in this matrix. Thank you for tuning in. You can check us out right here at tfrlive.com/Eye of Ra to support the station, and check us out at the chat room, tfrlive.com/chat. Also, you can find my lovely guest tonight, the amazing Mr. Gary Wayne at Genesis60.com. And there's actually no better person in the world I can think to have tonight on this topic here on the spring equinox on March 20th is my buddy Gary Wayne. And Gary, let's get really deep now, because I wanted to explore this topic like I've never heard it explored before. And I really feel that Nephilim intelligence, some sort of cosmic intelligence, you want to call them Rephaim spirits, however we want to call it, guided what we call St. Patrick today on his course. Now, you set us up pretty good in the first segment. I mean, he was brought, most likely, purposely, I feel, sent into captivity to learn for 6 years under these Druid priests, right? And then guided towards Saint Germanus, Saint Germain. And Saint Germain sort of like, so he's already now acknowledged with it from Druid priests, received maybe even initiations into the Serpent Brotherhood under the Druid priests. And then he goes under Saint Germain's wing for a little while. And Saint Germain prepares him for his journey and his life to come, right? And then when, they have it recorded in the church that when Saint Patrick before I hand it back over to Gary to respond to this, when St. Patrick leaves St. Germain to go start his preaching, he comes and encounters pagan priests, Druid priests. And legend has it that he comes against this chief of priests. And this priest was able to raise himself high in the air by this magical levitation force. But then when Patrick started to pray, he slammed this Druid priest to the ground, crushing his bones and murdering him. Very entrance into his way to preach for the church, or to preach for whatever's guiding him, right? So his first, when he's starting his first upbringing into who he becomes, it starts with a murder of a pagan priest. And Gary, when they say that the St. Patrick chased the snakes and serpents out of Ireland, is he talking about Druid priests? Because I don't think people think that they actually mean, snakes, like physical snakes. But I think that he was murdering people. So this guy, before we talk about him even resurrecting the dead, necromancy, he was actually murdering people with his magical powers.
Yeah, so you've got a lot that you've put in there. So let's see whether we can flesh some out and put a little more color into what you're talking about. Not that what you're saying isn't fantastic and stuff, right? But there's always more to the story. So
yeah,
and so he's having a showdown at Tara with these Druidic priests, right? This is very similar to Elijah and the priests of Baal in the Bible, which again makes you kind of wonder a little bit about the story, but that is the story. And in most versions, he didn't, crush his bones. Most versions of the story is he brought lightning down from heaven to kill this Druid high priest.
Wow.
At Tara. Yeah. So he's using or tapping into some kind of really significant power. And there's a Gaelic word that's called gnadir, which means adder, and derives from Gaelic nadred, meaning serpent, and gnar, meaning serpent priest. And so that's exactly what the Druidic priests called themselves, was serpents, because serpents to them meant wisdom and knowledge, and they were tapping into this great knowledge bank of their religion. And the
sort of like the Naga of India, right? And so they're looked at almost as divine.
Exactly. And the Druids are remembered as some of the great knowledge people out of the pantheistic religions around the world. They're in the honor roll, like the Brahmins. Like they're not, they don't get the credit in the West for how secret societies and Gnostics view them.
Yeah.
So,
you're right.
There's a poem, 6th century bard by Taliesin saying, "I am Druid, I am architect, I am prophet, and I am serpent," which is Gnader that I talked about. And so Manly P. Hall, a Freemason and a Gnostic, what he said about the Druidic priests is that the Druid priests of Britain and Gaul called themselves serpents. And these two are snakes that St. Patrick is said to have driven from Ireland. So that there weren't any serpents in Ireland from any historical aspect, but their gods and their priests were immersed in serpentine imagery. And then you were talking about St. Patrick dipping into some sort of Nephilim power and knowledge. Intelligence. And so he did have that. And even if you recite or look into the Catholic Encyclopedia, it will tell you that he had an obedient so-called guardian angel that he communicated with and had visions of all of the time, and that actually names him as Victor. Now, Victor isn't an angelic name. It doesn't end in EL. If it was Victor L or, Azazel or Michael or Gabriel or something like that. But it's Victor, and I'm not making this up. It's absolutely a bizarre story, but this is the individual that provided him knowledge and power. And I think that was because it doesn't have an EL name. I think that's a demon spirit. I think he's like a shaman who, and the crazy clown aspect where they absorb these beings into them that gives them more power, as opposed to a normal sort of demon possession. Requires significant mystical adept knowledge to be able to control that demon, as opposed to that demon taking over and suppressing the spirit, right, and becoming the typical demon possession aspect. So this is something that the shaman were able to do, and the court jesters, which were great adepts of Europe, could do. But he was dipping into that. And then when you understand that he was mentored by Saint Germain, as you mentioned, then he's into this world of occult. And if he's educated with the Celtic Christians as they became the monks of Cluny, that Augustine was also part of, I mean, that was the Druidic Gnostic order that mold into Christianity, because Merlin said in the King Arthur tales that, which is deeply rooted in Tuatha De Danann mythology, history, and genealogies, and taking their lineage through those genealogies and those stories back to the Tuatha De Danann as him being a Pendragon and Guinevere being a fairy queen. They were like a demigod and goddess ruling over the Lord of the Rings of Anu, the Ring Lords, Knights of the Round Table, same imagery that's being set up there with the various kings like Gawain, who's the Green Knight, which has also a significant allegory that's in here. So you have all of this being interwoven into the St. Patrick story. And what he's going there to do isn't to drive physical snakes out, because there weren't any there. There never were. What he's there to do is to bring them into the Catholic Church. And of course, they're not wanting to do that. And so he's also there to close down their portals of power, if I can put it that way. He is there to close the portals that a lot of the beings, and whether or not they're the banshees or the shays or the demon spirits or little people, are coming through the fairy mounds, through the water holes. He's closing down the portals of their power to
the stone gateways that they have.
Yes, the fairy domens. That's what he's doing, to bring them into heel, to be part of this greater organization that's molded into the Catholic Church, until the time comes again where they can assert themselves more visibly.
Yeah, it's almost like some of these powerful mystics had to conform and work for the church in order to be who they wanted to be, and that was to explore their dark arts and mystic arts. And the only way to do that is to sort of work for the organization, because at first, it was reported that a lot of these guys like St. Patrick, St. Columba, they were looked at as necromancers, right? They were looked at as using some of the serpent arts and the dark arts. And then along the line, they sort of became, saints of the church, which is pretty weird in itself, that all of a sudden now they're looked at as saints of this organization, and churches are named after them and all of that, when they were, in my opinion, definitely he was using Nephilim technology. And it seems, Gary, that he became immersed in Druid intelligence, which is direct Nephilim intelligence connections through these stone portals, these stone circles, and all of this stuff while in captivity with the Druids. And then he used that very knowledge against them to shut them down.
Yeah, he did to bring them to heel, basically, right? It was sort of and he had powers that, again, backed up by the Catholic records and encyclopedia is that, and again, this mentoring under Saint Germain comes out of that sourcing as well. But he resurrected 33 different people. This is not things that are done in the Christian church, right? And one girl that had been dead for, weeks and weeks and weeks that he brought
Already
back
buried.
to life. Already buried, yes.
Already buried. How is this possible?
Yeah, and some up to many, many years. He was dipping in at a level rarely ever seen in the world that you have much for records on, and it's recognized that he did this by the Catholic Church. And the only way somebody like this is going to become a saint is by the power that these monastic orders hold within the Catholic Church. They're that powerful. So, I mentioned, and we're not going to talk about this individual a whole bunch today because he's a show on himself, but it's this individual that I'm going to mention now. His name is Saint Benedict, who's probably taken his name and title from the Benedictine monks or vice versa. And he's the second most powerful individual of the Catholic Church at the creation of the Knights Templar, who gives them the Red Cross as their emblem, who writes the letter makes the argument to give them a papal bull for their establishment. And he's the one who writes the articles that are known today by Master Ronsolin for the order of the Knights Templar, who are all Gnostics and Masons and royal bloodlines, and 2 Benedictine monks that are in there as well, just to boot, because again, they're part of the bloodlines, as I mentioned earlier in the show. And this is the organization that he basically gets papal permission to turn into the most powerful organization the world had ever seen to that point. And, banking, army, lost knowledge, you name it, they were into it, teaching. And this is the Saint Benedict who brings the failing Celtic Christian church that Patrick brings into Christianity in Great Britain. He brings it in officially to the Benedictine order at his time. So all of this, if you trace its history, has connections that hold the levers and the keys of power within the Catholic Church, and there's no other way to explain it. And that ends up in St. Patrick, somebody who is akin to Simon the Magus in the occult world, is made a saint in the Christian Church.
Yeah, it's truly amazing. Even with Saint Benedict, and we should do a whole show on that, because I even, he had a sister that's a saint as well, who could have even been his twin sister. And she was known to even be able to affect weather, make it rain when she was mad and upset, and things like this. So they seemed to be of a powerful bloodline as well. He was on a sacred mountain in Italy for his headquarters, and there's so much along with Saint Benedict. And he was also another one that had resurrection miracles attributed to him, and other things. And like you said, I do feel that St. Patrick is directly from Rephaim or Nephilim bloodlines, and that was inside of his blood. And there's little clues that I found that might point to it. Of course, everybody has seen the pictures attributed to St. Patrick with his spiral staff at the end, the spiral staff. Well, there's a story that goes along with this spiral staff, Gary, that talks about how Patrick went to go sign the tomb of his grandfather with his staff. And he had it opened. He did his magical prayer, and then he when he wanted to touch the body of his grandfather with his staff. So he had the tomb opened, and when they saw the body, they reported that it was a man of very great height. They said, truly a giant, but just big enough to be just below a giant. For whatever that means. What does that mean? 7 feet tall? 8 feet? Like, what does that mean? Like, where's the cutoff? So they said that it wasn't typically a giant, but a man of very, very great height. And they talk about he was a man of great height. not as big as a giant, but he had recently been raised from a huge tomb by Patrick, and he came forth from the tomb after he did this magical staff, whatever he did with the staff. He did some praying, and he touched him with the staff. And the grandfather then reports that he described torments that went on while he was in hell. And that he had to be baptized, and he had to receive the Eucharist and all of this. And so that's a very interesting thing that I feel might be a connection to his Rephaim bloodline. My father was, holy crap! I mean, his father was his grandfather was of great height. So what are they talking about when they mean great height here?
Yeah, great height. I mean, there's a lot of giants in Irish history, and there would have to be because of the Tuatha De Danann. So a lot of people think that the Patrick name comes from the Kilpatrick bloodline of Northern Ireland.
That's an interesting name, yeah.
Yeah, in itself, yeah. That goes back to Niol and Skoda that intermarried with the Tuatha De Danann. So this is a combination of scioning of many sort of bloodlines. But that's one theory on where his name sort of coincides and goes back to bloodlines. But he's from I think he's definitely part of the Druidic bloodline of kings and priests that are come from Terra. Yeah. And that's how he's able to be comfortable on where he's going to go to take on the Druidic priests, because it's not foreign territory for him.
I mean, he would have to be, in my opinion. I mean, do you think they just teach the average slave all their mystical secrets? Right? Like, come on, the guy you say all of a sudden he's a slave, he comes into captivity and he emerges 6 years later immersed in their deepest knowledge.
Yeah. Well, and there's also another individual that kind of is through a bit of mythology. Sometimes the datings don't always work, but a fellow by the name of Fionn Mac Cumhall, who's a hero who also helped Patrick close the shays and the portals to the other worlds, and he was a giant. So, I mean, he obviously knew giants because he grew up with them, whether or not he was a giant himself, but one presumes he was probably larger than the average human being, and he was akin to these giants just through his bloodlines. So.
Yeah, many called him like he was an Iron Man. Many people said he was an Iron Man. And it seemed that he lived pretty friggin' long. They're saying he was born sometime in the 380s, and then he died in the later 400s.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So he was around for a while. And, it's also interesting that you have other things that have been overlaid onto St. Patrick's Day that I don't think is a coincidence. And those things that are overlaid onto him are also the leprechauns and the three petaled cloverleaf, and those all have
he's the one who described that as the Trinity, right? Yeah.
Well, he used the clover as so the story goes, as a way to explain the Trinity, that if you go biblically back to the Word who became the Son, he's a branch that came from God, right? So his explanation, which kind of makes some sense, is that you have three aspects to the trihood of the Word, the Spirit, and the Father, and that idea of a branch would be like a branch of one of the petals, and showing how they're part of the same, they're on the same playing field and perfectly harmonious, but they're somehow distinct, right? But the three-leaf clover is very much an occultic plant, and it's a trefoil, and it's used as a protective amulet to protect yourselves from spirits. So he probably was wearing some sort of amulet that was associated, that then sort of becomes overlaid onto the mythos, because it was probably there. And the three-petaled clover is also, it leads to gold and treasures. So knowledge and probably portals and things like that. It had all sorts of purposes, and it was used in chants and in spells. And what's interesting is that the clover is related to the green one, the green goddess, which is equated with the green goddess of Egypt, which is Uto, and depicted as a snake again. And none of this is sort of coincidence, and it's also something that the leprechauns are associated with. So I'm sure there's about 15 doors there that you want to go down. But I think we have to look into that. He was using not only black magic, but he was also using his own beings other than the so-called guardian angel, but actual physical beings of the lower realm of the elementals, which are the leprechauns.
Well, yeah, the leprechauns is such an interesting aspect of it all. That's a really interesting way to go around, and what even what their DNA might be. And it's funny with a lot of the Irish DNA or Celtic DNA, even the origins of their names, it comes from very interesting things. Like I grew up with a family, the McNamaras. And I remember when I first started researching like hybrid bloodlines, and I was looking up certain things. It even said that the McNamara clan, it actually means like son of the sea hound or son of the seal, or or part seal, that they actually descended from seals. And a lot of McNamaras have like small arms, they say. And the bloodline is actually like because they actually were part seal. And I think that there's actually some truth in that sometimes you got to take the literal history as what they're saying, and it could have been from hybrid species going around at those there were peculiar times back then, and even the Kilpatrick, it has a very interesting origin like that.
Yeah, so I think we need to factor in, what we were talking about was a lot of this sort of Celtic history, and the clover intersects.
I want to get into the leprechaun too. Yeah.
With the shamrock, right? And that was, representative that if you were able to capture a leprechaun, you could get 3 wishes. And I think that's where that shamrock intersects with the clover with the leprechaun. So, but I know we're coming up to break, so I don't want to get into something we can't really finish in terms of the leprechaun.
We'll get right back into it on break. It seems that like we got like 30 seconds and break. It seems that like it's sort of like they're part of these inner earth dimensions. Even there's been books like the coming race where they report in the bowels of the earth. There's these gnome type, reptilian type hybrid beings, and maybe there's certain ways to activate them within the forest, like the shampoo. We'll be right back, guys. Don't go anywhere. Mr. Gary Wayne is here in the house on True Frequency Radio. Saturday night. We'll be right back after this. I'm Spiral out. Stick around.
Hi, my name is Ella.
Wherever you are, make it Truth Frequency Radio.
Welcome back, everybody. My name is Ra Castaldo. This is the Truth Frequency Network, and you can find us at tfrlive.com/chat if you want to join the chat room. You can also find me at the mysticalspiralstore.com and on YouTube. And you can also find our guest tonight, Mr. Gary Wayne, on Facebook, and you could find him at the Genesis6Conspiracy.com. Pick up the book Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and there is so many things that he explores in the book. It's literally a must-have for anybody interested in the Bible, in the Nephilim, in the Rephaim, Masonic bloodlines, and the New World Order. It's all talked about, and we had a very interesting first half of the show, Gary. I mean, really, really interesting. And we can also go further into St. Patrick as well tonight. But I think we should stay a little bit on that topic that we were closing at the end of the last segment with the leprechauns and these underworld, maybe inner earth, hollow earth, however you want to look at it, interdimensional reptilian hybrids that seem to be, or I don't know if we should go there right now. Maybe I'll mention a little later in the show. But in the early 2000s, 2001, September 2001, actually left New York right before the World Trade Center, and I was linked up with this family down there. I ended up going to work in Phoenix, Arizona for a little while, and the family was a very interesting family. And they actually were on top of what they called a reptilian hive right in Arizona. And there was mysterious things happening with that family. And I could tell you some stories that happened. I started actually doing a documentary on it back then. And I had talked to David Icke and all these other people who were researching it at the time, James Bartley, how I met all these different people, how I got in the field. Because of the reptilian connection and beneath the world, underworld, and beneath our very feet, how there's some sort of inner earth type world. And this is what I think exactly what we talked about, and how the Druids were directly connected to this. I mean, in Celtic mythology, Gary, right? They have the Danann, like we mentioned, but they were a powerful Druid type tribe, or Nephilim tribe, if you want to say. Or just the Nephilim intelligence, and they talked about how they would descend into the underworld through what are called the Siddhis, right? It's spelled Sidhes, I believe, the Siddhis, and this is like their underworld, right?
The Shay.
The Shay. Oh,
pronounced Shay.
The Shay. That's how it's pronounced. Yeah. So I mean, this could be sort of like what they're even discussing in the book, The Coming Race, that I have by Edward Bueller Lytton, and he talks about these beings called the Ana, who are like they basically hike through a hole in the earth, through these chasms beneath the earth, and they see these reptilian type hybrid creatures, and this could be what the leprechaun is, right? And maybe the Druids had a specific way to call them forth from beneath these inner earth worlds and bring them. Maybe it is through some way, through a spell with the shamrock.
Yeah. Well, the Tuatha De Danann is the ancient race, according, of the Tuatha De Danann in the mythos. And they're part of not only the Shining Ones and the fairy faith, which is more of an allegory for the matriarchal bloodlines versus the dragon bloodlines. And that's how Pendragon intersects, because the matriarchal bloodlines are dragons and owls. And in this case, Pendragons, just as Arthur was a Pendragon, son of Uther Pendragon, and those were the leaders of the Celtic dynasties and worked closely with the Druids in that same sort of organizational structure that I referred to earlier, and that their symbol was a snake, and that the snake was a symbol of wisdom and ancient knowledge. The tribe of Anu is a serpent god, just as Tiamat is a serpent god, and Tiamat is equivalent with Korah of the Irish gods, and she was a serpent god as well. So, and Korah is also associated with her counterpart in the Irish mythology of the Green Man, or Durg Korah. So as sort of a pairing, just as Tiamat had, a male counterpart in the Sumerian pantheon.
Interesting.
So
Tonight too is the night of the Green Man, isn't it? Tonight is the night.
It is. Yeah. No, yeah. So in March 17th is a number that they say St. Patrick died on, which are two prime numbers that's as closely associated to just before the equinox and the Green Man celebration. So none of those things are picked by coincidence as you start to peel some of this stuff back. And the Tuatha De Danann, as a tribe of Danu, they were depicted early on as serpent beings because they were created by fallen angels, which were the seraphim, fiery, serpent-faced dragon angels. And that's why you have the dragon imagery throughout the kingships around the world and throughout the gods. And so they were originally had that serpentine look. And so they were like the snake people and the shining ones, and their eyes shone. They would actually literally light up a room. And they were the bloodline of this dragon messiah, the Messes out of Egypt that I talked about earlier. And they hold the fate of the world in that bloodline, which is another way the fairy allegory comes in, coming from the fates, which is, usually are depicted as three who hold, the secrets to what's going to happen, but they're depicted as the fate bloodline and the elven bloodline, which is an allegory for a fairy type of people, as in elves, right? And what's interesting is that as I weave this back to what you were talking about, the leprechauns, is there's 4 different classifications of the elementals, which are the little people. Yeah. You've got the snake ones, which are the salamanders, and they are quite a bit larger than the other 3 and are a separate being and are higher up in the hierarchy than the other 3 elementals. And each one of them are associated in the occult with, one of the main, I'm trying to search for the word, but, like fire, wind, air elements. Probably why they're associated with the elementals. And so salamanders is one, and that's part of that serpentine about, just as those are going to be probably distinct from the Nahesh because the Nahesh were bigger than that. They were probably the size of camels, according to some Gnostic Gospels. So they were quite a bit larger, but they weren't giant size like the Nephilim, which were the offspring of the seraphim for the reptilian beings. Now, the other 3, they're standard as well around the world. So this is a worldwide history, and they all fall into these 3 different groups. So the other 3 of the elementals are what you would call the good-looking ones, and then the little people. And so they're like nereids and sprites and nymphs and mermaids and things like that. And, in some of the tribes in First Nations in North America, they're called the dogwood people. And every tribe and First Nation in North America has these 3 classifications and has a name for each one of these categories as well. Then you have the ugly ones that you were talking about earlier, like the gnomes and the trolls and the dark elves and the hobbits and the dwarves, and all of these various ones have specific agendas and roles that they do. So like in the Lord of the Rings, which is an antediluvian tale, you have the dwarves who work in the earth creating the weapons for the gods and for the demigods and for the warriors. That's what they do. They're smiths, and they create these weapons. And then you have the mischievous ones that include like the Menuhe out of Hawaii, or the brownies, or the pixies, and of course the leprechaun and or the laurel people that are also known in some of the First Nations in North America. So the leprechauns are part of that little people, and the leprechauns are sort of the solitary, don't usually have great numbers of people, so they work alone for the most part and will associate individually with people. And they're a supernatural being, and they're a trickster spirit, and they have a changeling capability. So these are quite powerful people. And the trickster spirit is related, as we talked about earlier, with what seemingly St. Patrick was doing with his so-called guardian angel Victor. And so I'm pretty much convinced as I connect dots that it was this connection to the demon spirit world that is uniting him or sending him part of that hierarchy of the elementals, and in this case, the leprechaun. And what's really interesting about the leprechaun, and you're going to like a little bit about this, I think, for sure, Ra, is that it has a couple different etymological, kind of butchered that word, a couple of different etymologies to its origination. And one of them is Lukerpan, which means small body or a small god. And of course, I'm going to come back to that in a second. And the other one has an etymology back to Lupercalia of the Etruscan pantheon and the festival at Palatine Hill that we talked about on St. Valentine's Day. Yeah. Now, what's interesting about this Lukerpan, that's like their little green person, like a leprechaun that Peter Pan is. And of course, Peter Pan is an allegory for the Cernunnos god or the horn god or the green man, just as that would be related to that Uto god, the green one. Again, all of these were originally snakes because the pan gods, whether it's Bacchus, Cernunnos, Cern, or Ezaphome, all of these goat gods were degraded from seraphim angels, right? The serpent ones, after the rebellion, the ones that didn't go to the abyss. And so this all plays back into that same bank of beings and knowledge that St. Patrick was dipping into. And so I think he had leprechauns with him as part of his traveling magic show, so to speak, that was like a Simon the Magus contest over at Terra when he brought the Druids to heal, that they needed to go underground and be part of the secret societies going forward.
Yeah, I think that's here. I think you're exactly correct that he was tapping into the fairy realms, and when you're doing all this, I mean, there's all sorts of mystery traditions in associated with the witchcraft of the Nephilim, and especially when it comes to like the fairies and being the queen of the fairies and associated with that, and there's a tale that's in that area of Angus Og and Lu. Which was like she's like a fairy maiden or fairy goddess, right? And Angus sort of has this vision, almost like a Marian apparition, where he's like has this beautiful woman that appears to him in a dream, and then he starts obsessing over this woman, right? And he's enchanted, right? Infatuated. And then it comes to a point in the story where he finds the woman that, you know, he's in the fairy realm. And they basically unite, and they're transformed into swans, and they fly off into the other world, which they call Brug na Boin or something like this. I'm not exactly how to pronounce it in Gaelic or however it is, but it's a very interesting tale of diving into an underworld dimension and them transforming into these hybrid creatures, and having some sort of mystical ability where. Even talking about where people are becoming slain and resurrected from the dead as well, associated with a lot of these, right? Where they're speared and they come back from life. Even St. Patrick's talked about how he was speared by a druid and he almost died and he was able to survive. So it's very interesting.
Well, with the bloodlines, you know, and if they were pure, and if Patrick was as large as we think he was definitely part of the giant bloodline, is that they had the ability to heal themselves to a certain degree. And so if you didn't take their head off, then they could heal themselves. And that's partial to the meaning of Rephaim, which is the plural of Rapha, which has three different meanings. One is, you know, a tribe of giants. One is the demon spirit, both aspects of the same being. And Rapha is the root word for being a physician or a doctor or a healer. And it's thought because they were so hard to kill that they were self-healing. And so that as the root word. is the extension of the same being through the demon spirits and through the giant aspect, which is, I think, 7495, 7496, and 7497 of the Hebrew lexicon. So, and they're all interconnected as they describe the same type of being. So it would make sense that St. Patrick would have been hard to kill. And besides that, they would have had all sorts of occult medicines and knowledge to be able to heal that they wouldn't have been necessarily sharing with the poor people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's very interesting too, with just the sort of the I wouldn't even say that. I mean, he was. Even in the Bible, like with Rephaim, like you were saying, the different meanings, I always found it interesting that like sometimes they substitute the word dead things for the Rephaim, right? Where it's almost like they're dead things coming back to life, or they're disembodied spirits, or they're dead things like Walking Dead, or something like that.
Their physical bodies are dead, but there's still that presence. That's the demon spirit. So when it's being referred to the dead in the Bible, that'll be the root word. The second or the first branch off of 7495 for healing, it'll be the demon spirit, or the spirit of a dead person.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So and like I say, one has to sort of understand a lot of the Hebrew words and the larger meaning in terms of the words that they're connected to, and then how they're applied. Because not always that word Rapha is going to be used for giants. Like it can also be used for healing or a doctor, right? Or you've got an angel, Raphael, which means healer of God. So there's different ways you can use the word, but the essence of the word, I think, derived from these giants.
Yeah, and when we talk about too these little people, or even in some legends and some even like I think it's the Hopi Indians, even I know they have an underworld called Zipapuni, I think it is Zipapuni, but they called certain people the ant people, right? And the Hopi, I mean, they have something that's very similar to what was even reported in more modern times in Los Angeles. So the Hopi Indians, of course, they talk about how they went underworld to Zipapuni, which is like where they said they actually originated from beneath the ground, right? So, and then this guy that was called G. Warren Schufelt in, I think it was the 1930s, 1933, if I'm correct, was where they were drilling a tunnel in the middle of Los Angeles, right underneath the ground, and they found like these tunnels where they said a lizard race was inhabiting deep beneath the earth, right beneath where Los Angeles is. Have you ever seen those newspaper article clippings and copies?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think this is directly what we're talking about right here, right? We're talking about some sort of reptilian race where you can't just go into this access. It's sort of like an inner world dimension, and there's certain you need certain certain access, and it takes certain technologies and certain arts. You have to be an adept.
So let's connect a few more dots then on that. So the Hopi also have their history for after the flood, that they descend from the White Snake clan, that either spawned a race or gave them the knowledge. So they have this association with this serpent race as well, that I think is the same race that we're talking about with the Ophites of Ireland. And those portals that they're talking about, again, is directly related to the fairies and the Tuatha De Danann, but they're also related to Diana, the queen of the fairies, right? Yep. In which you're very, very familiar with. That is called also Deoan, or Diana Shea, Sidhe. And so she's the queen of the portals as well. as well as being the queen of the fairies and the mother goddess of that matriarchal bloodline and physical offspring. And Diana controls the portals. And she controls the fairies that she sends to guard those portals. So you have in the Arthurian stories, you have the ladies of the lake. They're protecting the water portals. And so you have different beings that are protecting all the various kinds of portals into the underworld, into the earth, where, as you're talking about, there are all of these different kinds of beings that seem to be mostly serpentine kinds of beings that we, kind of hard to fit in at exactly who they are because we don't get enough descriptions on them, but they're not giants and they're probably not the salamanders, but they are a fairly large type of being. And, this is the same Roman goddess as you're familiar at the temple of Nemi. And this is the same sort of, pantheon that produces Cern, that god of nature, which the green man is completely associated. And she's the woodland fertility goddess. And this is one of the ancient religions, just very mythos is the ancient of religions and the most, they would qualify it as the most advanced religion and knowledge of the ancient religions that's going to take a preeminent place in the end time. And what's also interesting about all of this connections with Diana is, our friend King James, who wrote a book called Daemonology, which, covers all of this material. And
I know I have a copy. It's very interesting.
Well, did you want to talk a little bit about that? You go ahead if you like. I mean, it has a lot of connections.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked through it. I've had copies of it. I don't know how well it's from the original, but this especially the time tonight. I mean, we're talking about the springtime that the Lady of the Lake first returns from the winter realm. And that's the whole night, and right, this is when the Lady of the Lake and the Lord of the Reeds, or however you want to look at it, this is where new life emerges in the woodlands, and this is where the Green Man first arrives with the fairy maidens.
Exactly.
Right? This is the night of it. This is where he comes with his moss growth all over him, and his staghorn is starting to emerge. Yeah. And he takes his throne in the sky, right? This is where it comes down, and where the sky and the earth meet, and the new life forms, right? And this is a time, and the demonology. I mean, with King James, it's very interesting that he would be even to write a book on this, right? And
two books.
Yeah, so how does one even become because it's almost like he's persecuting it in a way, letting people become aware of it, but then he was immersed in it.
Yes. Well, because he was an adept raised from childhood as a pure bloodline, and he's the Stuart Unicorn dynasty, right? He is part of the most ennobled bloodline of the time. And so he sponsors the writing of the Bible, but probably more for political reasons, to unite all of the various factions of Christianity, just as Constantine established Mithraism and Christianity as a homogenized religion to be the state religion, because it worked for the Persians with Zoroastrianism before that. So I think he was doing the same kind of thing, but he's part of this whole bloodline and occult history. And he writes in there that the epitaph of Diana is basically Titania, right? And Titania is in Midsummer's Night Dream that Shakespeare writes about in the same time frame as King James, and thought to be Francis Bacon in disguise, writing this through his writing societies, which are I think the Knights of the Helmet and the Spear Shaker Society, where the Shakespeare name seems to come from. And
I was going to say Shakespeare, yeah.
Yeah, and the husband to Titania, and Titania is a female name for a giant, an earthborn giant, is Oberon, which is the king of the fairies and the overlords of the Tuatha De Danann and the Ubers of the Sisters.
We'll be right back after.
Real people, real radio.
Initiating the truth frequency.
This is Truth Frequency Radio.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Truth Frequency Radio Network. So glad you guys are sticking around. What an amazing show it's been so far. This is the last segment. I'm so glad Gary's here on the spring equinox to talk about St. Patrick and the Nephilim connections. And, you know, going into a little bit of the St. James, that's a very interesting, King James, and it was King James the First, right? Because I have two copies here. One is a reprint. It says Demonologist Original Edition 1597, and it was a reprint from like 15 years ago that a publisher put out privately. And this is like it's basically like a commentary between two people. Where what's the names here? Let me see. Philomathes, and Epistemon. They're basically reasoning and talking about the subject of witchcraft and demons. And wasn't it King James too, Gary, who was the one that used to like that whole quote "swimming the witch," where he would like see if they drowned and all of that. So he was like torturing witches and things like that.
Well, that was certainly part of the Puritans of that time. I don't recall anything that he was doing to prevent that, so which is kind of odd. But maybe it was more to discredit the Puritans at the time, because they were also trying to flee England from persecution. So, but what I do know is that when he's writing about all of these topics, a
lot of Catholic heresy too in there too.
Yeah,
like talk about Catholic heresy. Yeah.
And the sort of revisionist history of it is that he's an apologetic for Christianity in terms of having an understanding for what the occult side is, and he's actually putting out a full doctrine as to the belief system that he was initiated into. So and the King James Bible, it has a lot of things encoded in there that has his belief systems, like the unicorn, for example, right? In the unicorn, the Hebrew word rem, which means wild bull, not the unicorn that we understand it as today in terms of the mythos. And today's mythos of these playful little one-horn horses aren't what the unicorn was. In the Rephaim and the divine right to rule, which King James ruled from, which comes from the angels that procreated his race, from Mount Hermon and the Baalim after the flood, that this was a horse that wasn't on the ark. And typical of the mythos is well, they were just playing joyfully and they didn't, they forgot to go to the ark and so they weren't saved. That's not what happened. These were giant animal beings, and they had parts of many different kinds of animals and this big red horn and this big white body. And they were the horses that the Nephilim rode as kings and warriors and into battle. This was a DNA manipulated military biological weapon that was used by the Nephilim, and that's why he has a unicorn on his coat of arms, because that's also associated with some sort of divine being that I've not been able to identify, but some sort of being of the heavenly realm. And if you look at the coat of arms, it's all taciturn language of their genealogies and the history. And so typically you're going to see dragons and serpents and eagles and lions and all things that go back to the originating, procreating gods, including the seraphim dragons. And so that's all encoded within that imagery of the coat of arms. And he's also part of the green gold dynasty. And of course, green goes back to the color of, the nature part of the religion of the spring festivals, as in the Green Man and on and on and on, and Peter Pan and Cernunnos and the horn god. And gold and green are part of the leprechaun allegory as well, because there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, which is maybe not necessarily gold, but probably knowledge. And the rainbow is the allegory for the flood, and the symbol of the flood's not going to return. And that's the lost knowledge that people are always searching for. And so he's deeply connected in this sort of leprechaun imagery. And if you Google Riders of the Shay, H-E, there's a very famous painting of these Tuatha De Danann, male and female, so queens, fairy queens and Pendragon kings riding these huge white horses. Now, they're not going to put a unicorn horn on the horse because that might be too obvious and they don't want to leak out too much information. But what they put on these horses are these metal face masks that have this large horn on it. So they're telling you that this is a unicorn, and the crowns they're wearing all have serpents on them because they're the serpent race, right? That's what they originally look like. And so again, within that painting, there's a lot of occult things going on in that painting. And this is a picture of the Tuatha De Danann and the fairy race. And this is, as I talked about, this bloodline, but more than just a bloodline. It's the elven bloodline that we talked about and I mentioned earlier, that they kind of weave in through the Edom chiefs in Genesis 36 as part of that, where Eliphaz goes back to a word associated with elven, and the dukes goes back to the Hebrew word aleph, and where they get the elven kingships that were closely associated with the Kassites, which are closely associated with the Marianu of that whole Middle East. So there's that intermarriage that was going on. But from the sort of pure aspect of this elven bloodline, it's of the Tuatha De Danann, it is by definition the matriarchal bloodline of the Tuatha De Danann, and it is the dragon Messiah bloodline that they want to present for the end time. It's also known as the Gens, just as Albigensians, which were a sister religion to the Cathars, which was the religion of the Knights Templar, and the cause of the Albigensian Inquisition and Crusade to get rid of that rival religion that was about to take over Europe of that time, which is kind of the backstory of the Albigensian crusade that the Catholics in Rome waged against them. This Albigens was also signifying the religion of the Albigens, or the Gnostic religion, but Albi goes back to a specific patriarch. It's eponymous of the starting of the race. And so Albi, as you take that back to Latin's etymology, and I won't go too far deep on it, it basically is meaning white and blanched white. And bleached white, just as the Tuatha De Danann were pale white, just as the Nephilim were pale white for the most part. I know there was some other colors, but these were the ones that were the most dominant. And this Albigens goes back to a gens, as in the Latin word gens again, as in a family bloodline or family tree, goes back to a specific patriarch, which is Albion. And Albion was part of the three giants of Wales, Albion, Gog, and Magog, that were part of many different waves of giants moving from the Middle East to England and to Ireland. And this is the elven bloodline of the fairies, or the elven bloodline, or the Grail bloodline is another name for it, of the Tuatha De Danann. So it's the bloodline of the fate.
Is that connected to the Isle of Avalon at all, or that's something completely different?
Well, the Isle of Avalon is, I'm always trying to figure out whether or not they're actually talking about an island, or is that actually another name for Anwin, which is another name for the other world, right? So it's, I'm not real sure on that, to be truthful.
Yeah, it's interesting too, like the word Albigens, even with Lake Nemi, the surrounding mountains are called the Albound Hills. You know, so that's very interesting. It's spelled Alban.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's Alban, like almost
Right.
like Alban Hills.
Yeah.
It's Albound Hills. Right. It's so that's very interesting. People just said in the chat room too that we're number one on TalkStream Live and Saturday Night Talk radios right now. So that's awesome.
Like that. You gotta like that. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, hopefully we're giving some really good information there that people can tie in some of the dots. So.
And what would King James' second book? That was the book on the incubus and succubus, right? That's where. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so I did see it. And then that one's very interesting because he goes through these different steps of what happens. Like first you got to like denounce Mary, and then eventually they step into the circle and the demon draws a circle, and all this stuff that happens on the way of possession of the person as they sort of take on the Nephilim spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, and how does this innocent king know all of this stuff?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was an adept by the time he was a teenager. So, but that's where the purebloods are initiated from within the families, and they become adepts of higher degrees before they're adults, but they can't take that adept title until they're a certain age, which is sometime just before 30. I've never quite been able to nail down whether it's 26, 27, 28, but it's sometime after 25, I think, that they can actually accept a adept title. So you might hear the term a 32nd degree adept, and there's 33 degrees in the Scottish Rite, which is either somebody doesn't know what they're talking about because you need to be 33 degrees to be an adept, but within the purebloods, that's kind of an allegory or a code word that they've been initiated since childhood because they are pureblood, but they can't take the title yet. So they call themselves a 32nd degree adept until they actually hit the right age.
Yeah, I mean, the thing too is like what struck me about what you said earlier in the show too is how some of the angels that were imprisoned, the fallen ones, they can't leave that sort of Tartarus, but there's another Tartarus, another dimension where it seems that they escaped after the flood, and you said that even they escaped to Scythia and different places like that, and maybe some of the ones that are moving from one otherworldly inner Earth dimension to this one are using some sort of UFO type devices or UFO type things that travel from them because that red haired bloodline seems to show up in a lot of like UFO contactee experiences. Like I know for one, Gary, I don't know if of course this one is a little less popular than the average one, but there was this story, I think it was from Brazil, about this guy Antonio Villas-Boas, who he was brought up on a UFO. He was abducted, and he remembers like almost being coerced or telepathically forced to have sex with this woman who he described as having these bright blood red armpit hair on her, right? And it's very red, almost the color of blood hair to her armpits. And that's what he really remembered about her, is the red hair. And then, of course, the famous case of Betty and Barney Hill. Barney Hill talked about how he saw humanoids on the craft and when he was getting regressed, and that one of them reminded him of a red-headed Irishman that he saw on the craft, right? So that's very interesting when those things come up,
Well, and the other connections in there, because, not all of the, small aliens that we have a standard view of, the grays, don't typically have hair, but there are other small ones that do. But what's interesting about the gray aliens is that back in the elemental group again, in the ugly ones, you have a group called the gnomes. And the gnomes looked after genealogies, knowledge, and the technology of the demigods and the gods, and were either recreated again after the flood, or were survived in the earth, off the earth somehow by some sort of angelic, fallen angelic assistance. But what's interesting about these gnomes is that they're known in Scotland and Ireland and other places and all around the world that they come through the fairy dolmens, the fairy mounds, the portals, with these flying machines, flying saucers, and they abduct people and they kidnap them for a fortnight, which is typically 14 did sexual experiments on it, and are trying to find new DNA and sort of add fertility into their own DNA, because they're having difficulty in repopulating, which again is quite typical of Nephilim kind of creations from the fallen angels. They have reproductive issues. So they're trying to replenish their DNA stock, and then they return the people after a fortnight and they don't have any sort of memory. And they're called the gray neighbors, or the grays. And their description in a fairy abduction is identical to a gray alien, which is absolutely bizarre. So they've been with us all throughout our history. They've just been known by part of the elementals in the fairy group, as opposed to the aliens as we know them today, because they were a little more technology advanced.
Yeah, I mean, even a lot of the abductees are redheads themselves. Look at Travis Walton, famous case of Travis Walton. He's very, very redheaded, And
but it makes sense. They're looking for people who have, let's say, hair color of the Nephilim. So blonde and red hair are very popular in the abductees, and they're looking for blue and hazel eyes, and they're looking for bloodlines. So Rh negative people are more likely to be kidnapped. And so I think they're looking for the gene of Isis as well, right? The spark of the divine. I think they're looking for that supercharged DNA to recharge their DNA. And so that's why Rh negative people are more likely to be abducted by a vast number than other people. And that's also why Rh negative people have a whole variety of things that are unusual compared to the average human. Higher IQ,
unfortunately,
typically
that's my
better
blood.
eyesight.
That's my blood
right?
too, as well.
Well, it doesn't mean anything, if you inherit it, innocently and naturally. But if you were to manipulate your DNA, that's a whole different ballgame. But they have a whole series of those traits, and I have a document for people who want to get a hold of me that sort of walks through this whole Rh negative and the gene of Isis thing and the abilities that they have. And I get a lot of RH negative people say, I heard you do, list all of those things out. And they said, I'm just going check as you're going through the list.
I was laughing to myself when you were saying it because I was like, I don't even know if he knows. But yeah, I mean, what's interesting too is like about these underworld dimensions is that some of the biggest innovations on our planet, I feel, is from direct contact with this. I don't know if you know this, Gary, but the man that invented the supercomputer, his name was Seymour Cray, right? One of the only things that he liked to do besides invent things was dig tunnels beneath his house. You can look this up about the guy, and he said that he had an encounter with fairies, and he sort of joked about it in some of his talks. But he said, he dug a deep tunnel beneath his house, and he had some sort of encounter. And this is where all of a sudden now he's inventing these supercomputers and things that we didn't have beforehand on this planet. So I think that direct innovations were coming from its cosmic Nephilim intelligence, basically.
Yep. Well, and we get elements as discussed in the Bible as elements and or rudiments, which are part of this whole rebellious hierarchy. And so it's these elements that are elementals that are interacting in the world and are providing, as it's called in the Bible, the wisdom of the world to the humans, and through their associated, sort of cousins of the bloodlines and the occult mysteries. So,
yeah, I mean,
this is a well-known fact that people, that secular science does everything to just sort of turn a blind eye to and not want to recognize.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems that a cosmic intelligence or Nephilim intelligence is behind what's steering the Catholic Church specifically, and other religious organizations. I mean, even with St. Patrick's history, I mean, I feel there was a Nephilim intelligence behind it, because these are not just men that are made a miracle and there wasn't just fallout from it. These were men that converted countries, baptized and converted whole groups of people, even a whole island, from being a pagan island to a mostly Catholic island, right? And there was some sort of, in my opinion, cosmic Nephilim intelligence behind that. I mean, between all of the resurrection, he has 33 resurrections from the dead, and all of these thousands of miracles, I mean, that are attributed to him. I mean, not to mention that he probably baptized and converted thousands of people. How many bishops did he ordain? How many priests did he bishops consecrated? How many churches did he have erected? Hundreds. And he ordained thousands of priests. And this was in only a couple of 3 or 4 decades. So
and you can't do all of that without supernatural power.
No,
it's just possible. So you have to have miracles. You have to have things that will turn people's heads, that they will change their preconceived beliefs. And I'm talking about the average humans at this point in time, as opposed to the bloodlines who would understand the power and the knowledge that he was working with, whether or not they wanted to be a rival or an ally of him. And so this is what will happen again in the end time. It's almost like an allegory for that. So as he converted all of Ireland over to this mystical aspect of the Christian church, and just as you have Kabbalism as the mystical part of Judaism, and just as you have the mystical part of Islam with the Sufis, and they're all interconnected and they all work together, you're going to have these powerful and miracles and catastrophes and signs in the sky that these kinds of priests, these kinds of warlocks, of witches, of priests and priests of the polytheist religion, as they demonstrate the power of their knowledge in the people who help them, they are going to create such powerful catastrophes and miracles that people will say, we will convert, and that's how they will establish the universal religion. There's no other way. There's no way, the Council of Churches and by meeting and, are going to have all of polytheism and everything come together. You're going to need these kinds of
when someone witnesses a miracle like that sort of miracle, you have their unshakable devotion plus their ancestors.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just throw this out to the degree, and we talked about how Patrick was able to raise people from the dead. People have been dead for weeks. Included in that 33 were people that were dead for years.
And already buried beneath the ground that he had to, be dug back up.
Well, and if they're buried for years, there's probably not much left of the bones, right? Or, I mean, of the flesh, there's the only bones.
Even his great grandfather, who was a very tall man,
Yeah, and he brought lightning out of the sky to kill his rival Druid priest in that showdown at Terra, which is what the false prophet is going to do in the end time.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of things that are layered into this in terms of the polytheist beliefs that they're going to bring about again when they bring about their new age.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about how this is supposed to come around again. It seems to be written in the prophecy that you've brought up in a prior show that as we're closing in the last minute. I mean, in the end times, you even said once before, someone is going to receive some sort of mortal head wound and then miraculously be healed.
Yes,
right?
That's in Revelation 13. That's the Antichrist figure. So he's going to fake the resurrection, and he's going to be empowered through the avatar as opposed to what we're talking about with the trickster effect here. But an avatar is going to use him as an avatara, just as Vishnu was an incarnation into Buddha. And that's that Christ consciousness doctrine that is going to funnel the power through Antichrist and have him be able to create miracles just like the false prophet did. And Revelation 13 tells you all about that.
Wow, thank you so much, Gary. Thank you so much for joining us. So, this will be on actually YouTube tonight. So, check it out. Out. Stay. Guys.